Yes, we may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I placed this afternoon 2 more volumes before you.
Yes.
The one would be the parliamentary transcription. We do not have to go through them, but
Yes.
for the sake of the witness, just to state what she needs to respond to. And also, I have placed back before you, Chair, the Exhibit 27, which deals with the Public Protector's report of 2014. And lastly, I have returned Exhibit 17.1 of Mr. Tegiso, because there's reference to this witness in that bundle.
Yeah.
17.1.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think the last part of our discussion, Ms. Mukobo, I wanted to just say that, and maybe I did say it, I've forgotten that you have responded, that seeing big volumes or stack of newspapers, or a particular newspaper always being delivered to the institution that should be making money with those newspapers in circumstances where it would be free, or you thought it would be free, may have been something that also should have been of concern, to say, we do have an agreement with these people. That agreement provides for everything as far as our relationship is concerned. Why are they giving us free newspapers now? You understand that perspective?
I quite understand it, Chair. What I stated earlier was that this could be construed as a form of a barter deal where there is no money exchanged. But the newspapers would come with content about the breakfast shows, which would mean that the SABC would have the right to see what had been written up about the breakfast shows. And that, Chair, I believe very strongly, should never have been something that the SABC would pay for. The SABC was already expending a lot of money to cover the broadcasts. Getting the newspaper in return just so the SABC can see what has been covered, what was going on. For those people, I mean, a lot of the staff at the SABC would not be able to see the breakfasts themselves, the shows, because they would be busy at that time. But having the newspaper would kind of give them an indication of what was discussed. And that was really from that perspective. But I think perhaps the people who did decide to enter into this commercial contract would have to be interrogated as to why they did it. Because it would have been literally adding money, your last pennies, to a very wealthy person. And that doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mukobo, can I just take you to just a few documents? We don't have to go to them, but just to put, first of all, I'd like to put to you the findings of the Public Protector. You are quite aware of those because the Parliamentary Committee dealt with that, am I right?
Yes.
Yes, and that related to the increment to the salary of Mr. Mutweneng, the second increment.
Yes.
And at page 268, the Public Protector made the finding, Ms. Lula Mukobo, the outgoing GCEO, for her improper, that disciplinary steps must be taken for her improper conduct in the approval of the salary increment of Mr. Mutweneng.
What page number is that?
That page 268, Chair. It will be in Exhibit CC 27.
CC 27.
27, that's correct, Chair. That is the February 2014 report of the Public Protector.
Oh, well, I was looking at this parliamentary transcripts. That's not the one.
It is not, no, Chair. That's correct, Chair. At page 268.
Yes.
Thank you. Those findings of the public protector did serve before the ad hoc committee of Parliament.
Yes.
And in the transcripts, you were asked extensively about the increment.
Yes.
Could you just tell the Chair briefly, because it will become relevant in another context later in the evidence before the SABC, as to why you approved the second increment of Mr. Hlaudi's salary?
Yes, Chair. When I arrived at the SABC, I think I've said it before, there was an outpouring of adoration on Mr. Mutsweni. There was a belief that he was doing an amazing job and that, he was not being paid enough, even as a group executive member, not as acting COO. And there was a parity exercise that was being undertaken by the SABC, through which people would be looked at from their scale code and then be given an increase if, in terms of their scale code, they were earning below par. And that was really all that the increase was about. So the public protector completely misunderstood that, and she thought that he was given the increase as COO, and he was not, certainly not given the increase. As the Chair may know, SABC COO salaries are very high, and that money that was added to his salary was nowhere near the salary of a COO. And what was very sad for me was that in that misunderstanding, there was no real room for me to challenge that final finding. I had responded to the draft finding and explained myself on that draft finding, but somehow it was ignored. Secondly, if indeed I was to be disciplined for having raised his salary just so that he could be on the same level as other group executives, I'm quite sure that the board, if it decided to embark on a disciplinary process against me, I'm quite sure they would have thrown it out, because this is a man that they were very happy with. And the other thing is that it was assumed that I had left the SABC because of the public protector report. It was certainly not because of that. My discussion to leave the SABC began in October, and that was a few months before the public protector report was released. It was only released in February, on the same month that, in terms of my notice period, my notice had come to an end. So it was just a sheer coincidence that she released it at that time. And yes, I would have stood up to the disciplinary inquiry and had my name cleared there. But it just didn't make sense at that point when I was leaving.
And maybe let me get the full context to this particular issue. Mr. Mtswaneng was receiving a certain salary for the position he held at the time. Was he still acting COO at the time, or was he already COO?
No, he was still acting COO.
He
remained
COO.
acting COO until I left. It's
Okay.
only after I was gone that he was.
Yes, okay. I think just talk more to the issue than you have. I just want to understand, because Sometimes one read all kinds of things in the newspapers, and I would rather hear exactly the context here. How did the whole thing arise? From what you say, it looks like it wasn't just him.
Yes.
It was looking at other people as well. So I just want to get the full context. How did the issue arise? Who did it apply to? What was done in regard to him? Was there anything done in regard to other people who may have been in the same category? And how much are we talking about? I just want the full context,
Yes,
if you
Chair.
do remember.
Chair, every year there would be a review process for salaries. And through that process, people who were being underpaid would be identified. He was one of those people. HR would then issue a recommendation.
Who would
For
issue a recommendation?
Human resources.
Human resources.
Yes. Issue a recommendation. They would give a status of the salary level and give a sense of what other people within that band were receiving. And then do a recommendation that says, we think this person should be at this level, this person should be at another level. Now, in Mr. Mutwening's case, his matter had to be approved by the board chairperson. And he duly approved it because he agreed.
That is the increase.
The increase, because he agreed that for the kind of work that Mr. Mutwening was doing, he certainly deserved that increase, and he signed off on it. And that's how it was paid. There were indeed other people at other levels within the organization. Unfortunately, I can't remember them properly, but perhaps that record can also be drawn from the SABC to see. It was certainly not just him.
So, is this something that the Human Resources Department would do annually? Or did it
Yes,
just
Chair.
come because of certain circumstances?
At the time, it came annually.
It came annually?
Yes.
And they would look at maybe everybody or certain categories of people that attracted their attention in terms of maybe salary discrepancies or things like that?
It went largely according to category.
Yeah.
The levels beneath management who belong to the bargaining council, their salaries were set in a very straightforward manner through the bargaining council process. And their increases were also determined through the bargaining council process. But the levels from management and higher, those would be subjected to scrutiny as to whether or not the individual was being paid appropriately. And yes, in many instances, there would be influence that would come from how much the person was contributing to the organization. If they were very hardworking and without doing a formal, shall I say, a very formal, very objective performance review organization-wide, you had to rely on the manager saying, this person is doing a good job, and yes, they are being underpaid. Let us look at their salary increase. Each one of them would bring a different motivation. There had to be a motivation. And on the basis of that motivation, then HR would then recommend a salary increase.
This may be something that you are able to deal with, or you might not be able to deal with. Maybe it might be a human resources kind of issue. But I would have thought that there could be an increase that is given that is attached to the position as such and not to the incumbent. To say anybody occupying this position as of this year, will be paid this. And that when you start looking at how well a particular incumbent is performing his or her duties, that might be something separate, and that it's directed at the person rather than the position. And in that case, that's when I would think of something like a performance bonus, because then that answers to the question whether a particular person or incumbent is performing well, separate from what a person occupying that position is supposed to be paid, irrespective of what the performance is. SABC didn't have that kind of distinction.
Chair is quite right. The salary increase was based on what people at that scale code were earning, and he was far below them. So he had to be brought up to match those people. There was no performance bonus payment approved during my period, during my time, and I was very strict about that, based on the fact that we were still in a very precarious financial position. Yes, the SABC was in slight recovery, but there were very clear terms of the government guarantee that the SABC had raised, which National Treasury had approved. And those terms were very categoric in stating what the SABC could or could not do with the money. And I was a stickler for sticking to those prescripts that were provided by National Treasury. It would also have been very responsible to try and give anybody a bonus when there was this massive recovery that the organization had to come out of.
Well, see, I raised that because you mentioned that everybody was saying that Mr. Mswaneng was doing so well, was performing so well, he deserved an increase. So I'm saying I can understand if that arises in a situation where you seek to reward good performance. But I don't expect that to be a factor where you are simply saying somebody who is doing this job should be paid at this rate, leaving out the incumbent or whoever may be occupying the position. So that's the background to my question, to say, why would his performance be relevant to whether he was given this increase if it was simply to put his level, the salary for his position to the level where it should be, where anybody coming after him would be paid at that level, irrespective of how he or she performed?
I really do take your point, Chair. This came out from how the case was motivated and the almost overwhelming push for him to get the salary increase. And the push was confirmed by Dr. Ngubane. So I'm putting this as, yes, there was that legitimate reason, which was to put him on par, but on top of that, there was the reasoning that he's also, over and above the fact that he's underpaid, he is also doing an excellent job.
But as far as you recall, the increase that he got, did it simply serve the purpose of putting the salary for a person in his position, serving in that position, where it was thought it should be, irrespective of the identity or performance of the incumbent, or was part of the increase to address that, and then another part sought to address or reward good performance on his part?
Chair, the increase was made purely to bring him on par with people of that level.
Yes. So based on our discussion, looking at it now, his performance should therefore have been irrelevant.
Yes, that's true.
If one
Chair.
looks at it now.
In a sense, it is true.
Yes.
Look, there were some doubts from other quarters.
Yes.
Based on what later came out from the incumbent.
Yes.
The things that he did, which were quite improper, and which then raised at that point some rumbles
Yes.
about whether or not he should have even been given a salary increase. That was obviously based on people's perceptions, because they experienced him in that particular way.
Yes.
But the fact is, he was deserving of an increase.
Or rather, he might not have been deserving of an increase himself, but his position, the
yes,
position
the
may
position.
have been deserving of an increase.
Indeed, Chair.
Yes, yes.
Thank you for that. Indeed, his
Okay.
position was
Okay.
deserving of the increase.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And lastly, before Parliament, another issue that was canvassed, the one thing that we have not spoken about is the date when you left the SAPC. When did you actually resign from the SAPC?
Sure. I put in my letter of resignation, I think it was in October. And in fact, at the board strategy session, which was held on that particular day, I don't have the exact date, which was held on that particular day, the board chairperson of that time, Ms. Ellen Shabalala, announced to the board my intention to leave. And that was in October.
Which year was that?
That was 2013.
2013.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe to assist the witness, the date that is contained in the settlement agreement for your last day at the SAPC is 28 February 2014. Is that the correct date?
Well, that was because after, yes, the 28th February, that was my last day.
Yes.
That was my last day at the SAPC.
Thank you. Thank you. In Parliament, a lot was discussed around the package that you received. You recall that? Chair doesn't have to go to it, but the relevant pages in the exhibit that's got a parliamentary transcript, which will now be exhibit, because we have not, we're introducing it for the first time, that will be exhibit 29.
I'm sorry, Ms. Makobo, I'm sorry we left out in our last discussion something that I had mentioned I would like to know, and you may or may not remember it, namely, how much was the increase that was given to him now? Maybe you might be able to say it was 10% of whatever he was earning, or is that something you can't remember?
Chair, it was much more than 10%.
Yes.
That I'm certain of. It was not 10%.
But you can't remember?
No, I can't remember the exact amount.
I'm sure arrangements can be made to find some documents
Yes.
I'm sure there would be some documents at SAPC.
There should be, Chair. There should be.
Okay.
I think the HR group executive may be able to provide the figures
The documentation.
when it comes.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, the pages that are relevant for this purpose are in the parliamentary report, which I asked that it be marked CC 29. That will be from page 1 to page 28. This is where these matters are discussed in Parliament relating to Mr. Motseneng, relating to the package or settlement agreement relating to Ms. Mokobo, and also matters relating briefly to the multi-choice contract, which is going to be one of the matters that this stream is going to be dealing with. But because at that point, the Parliament did not have these documents before it, and also for the record, for you to confirm, I would like to refer you to Exhibit CC 17, 17.1. This is the bundle that Mr. Tekiso had compiled. And I would like you to turn to page 155.
I'm not sure where to find it, Chair.
Oh, sorry, it's in, could you please assist?
I think somebody must
So
help
could you just
her,
help her? 17.1.
because she hasn't dealt with
Yes,
17.1.
sorry. Yes, thank you, at page 155.
Page.
Page 155. It starts, the separation agreement starts from page 154.
Sure. The numbering here is not
On top.
The red numbers on the top
on the
right-hand corner.
top. Oh, okay. And it is
Yeah.
page
154.
154. Yes, I see where it begins.
Yes, thank you. Is that the separation agreement between you and the SABC?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And then the amounts that you received, they appear at page 155.
Yes.
Yes, there was a lot of debate around how much you received. What was Parliament's information about what you had received?
Parliament was totally misinformed, and I'm not sure what the reason was, apart from probably trying to damage my reputation. Parliament was given a figure of between 8 and 11 million rands, and it was widely reported in media reports, and I was ridiculed, when in fact it was totally untrue. That's not the amount that I had received.
Yes. Could you then, for the record, and also to set that record straight, just read out to the chairperson the amounts as reflected on that page?
Chair, I received 4,221,179 rands and 22 cents, which was equivalent to 12 months of my gross cost to company, which was equivalent to the total remuneration that I was already earning at that time. And then I received a further 1.4,736 rands, which was for the restraint of trade agreement, which effectively barred me from being employed by an entity within the same industry. And there was a further accrual of annual leave, which was 395,652 rands, 51 cents. Seems like a lot, but I hardly ever took leave.
Thank you. And then lastly...
I'm sorry, that would have been roughly how much when you add all the three figures?
Yes. That was before tax, am I correct?
Yes, it was before
Yeah.
tax.
Those amounts, sorry.
It was about 5.6.
I thought you would just remember without calculating.
It was a long time ago, and there's a lot of stuff that I've buried.
Okay, well,
It was around 5
about
point-
six,
About almost 6 million, yes.
about 6 million.
Yes, Chair.
Yes,
Yes.
okay,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you.
And then lastly, there is something that Parliament dealt with in this inquiry, which is something that is going to come later, but there is a witness already who has given a statement to the Commission that is going to be called, a Mr. Roy Krueger.
I'm sorry, Mr. Norman, we may just want to make sure we don't leave this without,
Oh, yes, Chair.
with anything hanging.
Yes.
The amount that was equivalent to 12 months' salary or remuneration, why were you given that amount?
The agreement was that I would be paid for just 1 year. The agreement was that I would be paid for just 1 year. It was an amount that I suppose would be equivalent to what the CCMA would recommend to the entity, or if an employee was leaving before completing their contract, something like that.
Well, earlier on, and I assume you may have been sitting there, we had Mr. Tekiso dealing with people who were paid certain monies, amounts, and so on. And as I understand, the focus seems to look at whether at least some employees may have been paid more than they should have been paid, and the reasons or motives may have been illegitimate for doing that. So you didn't deal, of course, with the question of why you left, and that may be relevant to why you were paid that amount. But if you had decided to leave on your own without there being any dispute or anything, I know of no reason why you or anybody on a fixed-term contract would have to be paid for any amount if it was just their decision that they want to leave. So that's why I'm asking.
Chair, at that time, there was a level of desperation, in particular by the chair of the board, for me to go, because I had challenged a lot of her decisions very vigorously, and she was very angry with me. There are board minutes that show how we locked horns over the multi-choice contract, because I just did not agree with it at all. There were some clauses, and I've analyzed some of the clauses, I've written them down, although I've not given them to the evidence leader,
Yes.
which were completely inappropriate.
Yes.
But the chair of the board then decided that Mr. Mutwening and Mr. Olifir, who were both acting in their capacities, incidentally, should go ahead and sign that contract. And she was very abrasive with me. I had to take a week off, slightly less than a week off, to take care of my granddaughter who was gravely ill. So I took emergency leave. And in that week, while I was gone, they then decided to meet with MultiChoice and quickly conclude the contract, and then quickly agree that the contract must be signed. But that process was fundamentally flawed. I did not agree with the process in the first place of how they arrived at Mr. Mutwening and Mr. Olifir signing the contract, but secondly, there were clauses that were just totally improper that were included there.
Yes.
That was the first instance where we locked horns, and it was really ugly. It was very, very ugly. The second instance was when the then Minister of Communications, Mr. Yunus Karim, was getting frustrated with there being no industry agreement on the set-top boxes that were going to be used for the digital transformation of the country. And in terms of the broadcast digital migration policy of 2012, which was in force at that time, it was important for those set-top boxes to have a control mechanism, which was set to do a whole lot of things that would benefit the public, including the ability for the public to access messaging, to connect to the internet, and be able to do whatever they needed to do using the set-top boxes without even having to go and buy a computer. And to me and to a whole lot of other people, that was what expanding the knowledge economy to the poor was about. The poor needed to have access, but it was impossible for them to. And the argument was that, well, there's cellular telephony now, people can access content via cellular. It's extremely expensive. Now, those set-top boxes, particularly for the indigent, were going to be given for free. And if they had a set-top box which was encrypted and which could enable connectivity to a telephone line, so it would have a return path, then you would have citizenry in the most far-flung parts of this country, as long as they had even an old black and white box, who would be able to access government documents, their children would be able to access content for them to study. The benefits were just enormous. But all of that was thrown out when the multi-choice contract was entered into.
With regard to the last issue, are you saying that you and Minister Karim were at opposite ends?
No.
You're right.
No, Chair. Minister Karim agreed completely with the digital migration policy as it was published in 2008. He agreed with it. And as I said, so did a whole lot of us. I'm originally trained as an educationist. So for me, I saw massive benefits for the children of this country and the adults and anybody who needed to be informed. So he was in agreement with that, but he was frustrated because after the SABC had signed the multi-choice contract, the SABC and the multi-choice contract effectively prescribed to the SABC that the SABC could not accede to the inclusion of encryption on the set-top boxes. And by doing that, they basically threw out the entire plan that the SABC had and other industry players who saw the benefit of encryption. They threw it out. Now, Minister Karim was caught between two parties who were not agreeing with each other. The one party, of which multi-choice was part of, was saying there should be no encryption, there should be a simple set-top box. After all, people will eventually find these TV sets that would have these things built onto them, and this has still not happened up to today. You still need a decoder box from multi-choice in order to see their signal, so I'm not sure where they were coming from there. The other argument was that cellular telephony penetration was very high and people could access data and whatever. The third most ridiculous notion was that the SABC would willy-nilly switch off people using the encryption technology, and that is absolutely not what it was intended for. The SABC would never do that, at least not under my watch if I was still there when this was launched. Then you had, on the other hand, people who agreed with my perceptions, with the views that were expressed by the late Minister Matsu Kasiburi when she wrote she launched the policy, and many other ministers who agreed with that approach. So Minister Karim was caught between the two parties, the one strong voice saying no, 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 the other strong voice saying yes.
Now,
and so he brought everybody together.
Was the other voice Ms. Shabalala, the chairperson of the board?
The Ms. Shabalala voice was that there should be no encryption.
Yes, and multi-choice. No, she was on the same side as multi-choice.
She was on the same side as multi-choice.
Yes, but you were on the other side.
Yes, Chair.
And you know that Minister Karim was in agreement with you.
He was on the other side.
He was in agreement with you.
Yes.
You and him were on the same side
we are
on
the
this
same
issue.
Side.
Yes, yes.
Together with his
deputy,
his DG,
yes,
and other people.
Yes.
Everybody was in agreement.
Well, that issue, the multi-choice, as well as this digital, it was called
Digital migration.
Yeah, digital migration is something that the Commission is one of the things that it is looking at. I'm not sure how far the investigators are, but it is looking at it. And I am aware of some of the things because I sat in the Constitutional Court in a matter that came to the Constitutional Court at some stage about the issue of that policy. And all of those court papers should be collected. So, and I would urge you, if the investigators or the Commission might not have got much information from you in regard to that aspect, I would urge you, if possible, to give the Commission as much information as you know, because one of the things that certainly when the matter came before the Constitutional Court I couldn't understand is why it was taking so long for government to make up their mind one way or another on the issue. And I think I seem to remember that at some stage in the public media, maybe in the court papers, I can't remember, that the ruling party on its side was saying what is being done is not in accordance with the policy. This might not have been at your time, it might have been at a different time. But it was one of those things where you don't understand why it's taking so long to implement, and if there are challenges, why don't people just make up their mind, this is the right thing? If it is the right thing, we are doing it. If it's not the right thing, make up your mind and make it clear where you stand. But you say that, you are saying that your departure from the SABC was not really because you just wanted to leave and there was no problem. You say there was a problem, or there were certain problems, but you say in particular, you as the group CEO and the chairperson of the board at the time, Ms. Shabalala, you were in disagreement on the issue on this issue of digital migration and multi-choice. The multi-choice agreement making it almost redundant to look at the digital migration, or being inconsistent with the whole idea. You know, and the two of you could not agree on that, and she was insistent that she wanted it to happen.
In fact, Chair, she instructed Mr. Mutsoening and Mr. Olivier to go ahead and sign the contract, even though the contract had not been processed appropriately within the organization. In terms of the delegation of authority, it makes a very clear pronouncement on this. It says in page 2 of the applicable delegation of authority framework.
Yes.
Paragraph 2.4. It says, board committees are generally constituted with powers of recommendation only. However, subject to certain statutory limitations, the board may, in its discretion, delegate decision-making authority in any area to one or more of the board committees. Now, what had happened is, whatever Mr. Mutsoening, his team, and Ms. Shabalala were convinced was the right approach for the SABC should have been brought for scrutiny. At the very least, it should have started with the group executive members scrutinizing this in terms of the correct due process. And once the group executive had satisfied themselves that the contract, multi-choice contract, was fair, it was good, it made sense, or it was not good. But say they had said it was good, it made sense. They would then have to refer it to the Finance, Investment, and Procurement Subcommittee. That subcommittee would do the same rigorous process. And within that process, Chair, there would be critical things like risk assessment, the ability for the SABC to do what it still needed to do as per its mandate, with or without the contract, and to be put through a stress test to see whether it was truly eligible for signing off. And once the Finance, Investment, and Procurement Subcommittee had done that and it agreed that it was fine, it would then have to be taken to the board for the board to give its final stamp of approval. And once the board had done that, then the document could go off and be signed with multi-choice. But it didn't happen that way. The last discussion at the Finance, Investment, and Procurement Subcommittee, and at that time it was chaired by Mr. Mavuso, was that they had said, okay, can this then go to the next level for discussion? But when they came out of that meeting, now I was not in that meeting, that's when I was on leave. When that meeting ended, people then rushed off and decided that there was approval, they could go ahead and sign. So it was entered into unlawfully, just from that perspective, failure to adhere to process.
There was some rush to have it signed during the time when you were on leave.
Because I was an encumbrance.
Because you were standing in the way.
Yes, yes, Chair.
So would it reflect your thinking to say you were pushed out of the SABC?
Indeed, Chair. In fact, attempts to push me out had been going on for quite a while. I think at least 3 times. There were rumors swirling around the organization that I was going to be suspended or was going to be fired, and there were lots of lies that were being said about me. The most ridiculous ones being that I was a shareholder at ETV. Now, ETV, together with, was on the side of the set-top box control, the encryption.
Yes.
And therefore, because I was saying yes, encryption, and we were having industry discussions around these matters, they said I was a shareholder at ETV, and my children, 2 children, were working for ETV. I mean, people could go to that bottom pit of lies to tarnish my name. So much was said. I mean, it was said I was lazy, I was not doing my job, etc., etc. And things just got to a head. And
with regard to your children,
yes, Chair.
It was not true. You had no children working at ETV.
It was an absolute untruth. There was never even an attempt by my children to look for work at ETV.
Yes. So it was those 2 reasons around which you and the chairperson of the board at the time could not agree.
There were other reasons. I locked horns many times
Yes.
with Mr. Mutswening.
Yes.
He undermined my authority
Yes.
many times. And quite a few times, Ms. Shabalala gave me a dressing down in front of my staff, and I could never understand why she would do that. There was absolutely no decorum. And the reason was quite simply that, Chair, I was refusing to do things that were not according to policy. I was
Yes.
refusing to do that.
Yes.
And therefore, they had to find a way to sully my name as far as possible. I know for a fact that they canvassed the agreement of some top politicians that I should go. So at the point when I decided I was going to go was when it was like a final push, when the lies came out about me and my children and ETV and all of that, that's when I realized that these people were capable of killing me, because I just did not understand how anybody could have so much malice. And having locked horns with the chair, we both agreed that perhaps it was time that I should go. And I drafted a memorandum to her stating that I think it was time for me to go, and I hope I'll be adequately compensated because I was being forced to leave my seat at a time when I was not ready to, through their actions. And by the time, Chair, I think it's very important to note that, and this is something that is never reported on, that under my leadership, the SABC finances became extremely healthy. I had ensured that the advertising industry rebuilt their belief in the SABC, and indeed they did. So advertising money started coming into the SABC. I made sure that all the leaking taps were closed. By leaking taps, I mean, Chair, opportunities to spend money willfully for... Improperly, were closed. And I didn't succeed on all aspects. But where things came to my attention that could potentially cause SABC to lose money, I simply said no. And because of that, the dislike for me increased phenomenally. And the disrespect was just so intense. You can imagine being a group CEO and walking down the corridor and you know that your staff are thinking whatever they're thinking of you because they've heard this or they were present in a meeting when this was said. It's not comfortable at all. And I realized, Chair, that it was indeed time for me to go.
Well, some of this might not have been part of or at least maybe the details of what you intended dealing with, but it is quite important. And to the extent that it may be necessary, whatever you might not be able to deal with, which surrounds that issue, what led to your departure, what happened, it might be necessary for you to come back if need be, because it's quite important to understand those things, because certainly there has been evidence here in regard to other SOEs and to the fact that people who were standing for what is right and resisting any attempts to do wrong things, for standing in the way of people who wanted to do wrong things, would be pushed out in one way or another. And it's important for me to know everything that might make me understand whether yours is definitely that situation. But from what you have said, and I'm still going to hear other witnesses, it may well be that situation. So, but to come back to the amount that you were paid, so it seems from what you have said that when you wrote to the chairperson and maybe attached the memorandum or the draft agreement, you said you were prepared to go and you hope that you would be compensated appropriately. Is that right?
Yes, Chair. I did not write the memorandum myself. She engaged the services of an external party who drafted the separation agreement. Yes. I was not involved with that at all. Okay.
But whoever it was doing so on your behalf or on behalf of both parties?
No, on behalf of the chairperson.
On behalf of the chairperson.
Yes.
So there had been a discussion between you and the chairperson before the person was instructed to draft it?
Yes, indeed, Chair.
And in terms of that discussion, you had indicated that you were prepared to leave.
I indicated that I was intending to leave.
Yeah, okay.
And
yes.
however, I would stick to my statutory obligation of
Yes.
serving out notice for 3 months.
Yes.
And the funny thing, Chair, is that towards the end of my probation period, she wanted me to extend and stay until after the elections. 2014 was election year. And she asked me to stay on until after the elections. At that point, I just thought, you know, I cannot do this anymore. I'd reached the end of my tether.
Okay, but the amount that you were given, which I think you said represented, or the agreement says represented 12 months remuneration.
Yes, Chair.
Who came up with that amount?
She came up with it.
She came up with the amount.
Together with the
third party.
The third party.
Yes.
The third party is a well-known
Lawyer, or not really?
lawyer who
Yeah.
deals a lot with SABC staff matters.
Oh, okay, all right. So the amount didn't come from you.
No,
It came from their
it
side.
came from them, from their
their side.
calculations.
Yeah, and the way they explained it to you was that this is what the CCMA would normally award. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
Were you told that this is what the CCMA would award if, for example, you took the SAPC to the CCMA
Yes, the
for
CCMA would as
constructive dismissal or anything like that?
yeah, the CCMA would as almost a standard practice award 1 year.
That's what you were told?
Yes,
Okay, and then you accepted that.
then accepted.
So in a way, was it to you like a settlement to make sure that after that there would be no further litigation, or how did you see it? Or
True,
just
Chair.
as some compensation for the fact that you were not finishing your term?
Adequate compensation, if I was not finishing my term, would have been to be paid out the remainder of my contract. which was 3 years.
yes.
But I was not willing to engage in that fight.
Yes.
For the sake of
You
my
were just-
integrity.
Yes.
I thought, well, you know, and also the fact that there was a restraint of trade.
Yes.
It meant that my family and I would suffer for the period that I was under the restraint. So it was just fair that I should be compensated some money for not being allowed to work within the industry that I have been in for, at that point, it was more than 20 years.
Yes. But the one thing you are clear about is that you were pushed out.
Yes, Chair,
Yes.
indeed, certainly.
And all of this related to you being pushed out.
Yes,
Okay, thank you. And you say you have been pushed out of SABC for standing for what you believed was right and refusing to be party to anything that was wrong.
yes, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the purpose of the record, you would recall that after our consultation, you were requested by me that another statement would be required just on the multi-choice.
Yes, and I started writing.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Can I just to place the evidence of one witness that is going to come after you, maybe sometime next week, who just on this issue of multi-choice, his statement, you don't have to go to it. I'll just read out to you what he says. It's Exhibit CC 20 to 24, Chair. This is Mr. Roy Krueger. He says in paragraph 46, the DOC, in fact, if I may start from paragraph 44, just to confirm what you
Just repeat the page and number.
Page 12, Chair, of CC 20 to 24.
Are we on the same bundle or a different bundle?
No, this is the bundle, sorry. It's the same bundle, I beg your pardon. The same bundle that's got this witness's statement, I beg your pardon. it will be under, his statement is under
Yes.
divider number 20.
Okay, I've got it. And what's the page number?
The page number is page number 12. Are you there?
No, I
Oh,
don't.
I'll just read out to
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
He's talking about the very issue that you are going to deal with in your other statement, the multi-choice issue, the set-top boxes. But this is what he says in paragraph 44. Minister Yunus Karim set up a forum to try and get all parties to agree to using a STB control system or come to a consensus as to how to run the SADTT network according to the existing SA policy document. 45. Multi-choice and then supported by Mr. Muto opposed all suggestions of STB control in the DT network. 46, the DOC received letters of support and go ahead on the use of the Centec STB control system from both the then GCEO, Ms. Lura Mukobo, and then Chairman, Ms. Ellen Chabalala. That's what he says. So I just wanted to put to you that what you've said that you're in support, but then he also says that Ms. Chabalala was also in support of that.
Yes, Chair. Very, very strangely, we had made thorough presentations to the board on the DTT position of the SABC, which included the set-top box control and all the arguments regarding the benefits for the country, not for the SABC, for the public. And the board was happy and approved that policy position. And on that basis, Ms. Chabalala then wrote and we co-signed that letter. Then suddenly, I'm not sure what the date is on that letter. It's very important to recognize the date. Because then suddenly, she wrote a subsequent letter to Mr. Karim. And I don't have a copy of that letter, but I remember vividly. And in that letter, she capitulated and said the SABC was not going to support the set-top box control. Now, what I can't quite recall was how that was synchronized with the signing of the multi-choice contract.
Yes. Yes.
I can't quite recall that, so it would be very good to see the dates of the letters, because then we can work it back to when the multi-choice contract was signed.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, all of those things will be quite
dealt.
important to pursue, and all of the documentation. And whatever knowledge and information that you have, please give it to the Commission, because
I shall do
it's
so.
very important. My recollection is that there was a lot of money that was involved in that whole thing, and that it took so many years. I mean, up to now. I think sometime this year there was something in the newspaper. I don't know what development about them.
Thank you. In fact, Chair, we will show, we'll have a witness that's going to talk to that.
Deal with
and
that.
we'll demonstrate how those boxes are just lying somewhere in some warehouses without being delivered. So
Yes.
that's the evidence that we are going to leave
Yeah.
next week. Yes.
Yeah,
And yet
no.
vast amounts of money were paid for them.
Yes.
Yes. I think there was something in the newspaper sometime this year, and I think I asked Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Nombembe to take note and make sure that it's pursued, because it was something like they are lying somewhere and nothing is being done, and money is being lost.
Yes. The investigators have got all that, Chair. We'll show it to you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And those, Chair, were set-top boxes without encryption. So if there was this excitement about distributing set-top box without encryption, why were they not distributed? I don't understand.
Yes, yes. No,
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, that's for now the evidence from this witness.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Makoba.
Thank you, Chair.
And I understand that there is another statement that you had already started working
Yes,
on.
I've started working on it, Chair.
Yes, so you probably may be asked to come back at some stage. Arrangements will be made, but thank you very much for coming to share your knowledge with us about these issues. For now, you are excused.
Thank you, Chair. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, may I ask for leave to change seats and that my learned friend, Ms. Rasif Shele,
Yes.
take over the next witness?
Okay, how much time? 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
Chair, the only, 5 minutes? Do you need time? 5 minutes, Chair.
5 minutes?
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
Thank
we'll
you very
adjourn for 5 minutes. We adjourn.
All rise.
Yes, are you ready?
We are indeed, Chair. We're ready.
Yes.
Chair, before you, you will have two files. The first file being CC5 to C16.
That's the one I've been having.
Yes, indeed so, Chair.
Yes, okay.
And the second one is CC25. It's a
Yes.
small presentation file. Chair, today we have a witness.
Have we admitted the one for CC25?
No, Chair, we haven't admitted CC25 as yet.
Do you want us to admit it when you refer to it?
Yes,
Or-
so indeed, we can admit it now as by the Chair's direction.
The file containing the statements of... No, I think we did. We did. Now, I see it saying statements.
Oh, yes, we did so, Chair.
Yeah,
My
okay.
mistake.
You are much younger than me. You shouldn't forget so easily.
I shouldn't, Chair.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Today's witness is Mr. Krueger. He forms part of the well-known SABC 8. Just to bring to the Chair's attention that Mr. Krueger has a flight to catch later this afternoon. So if we have not finished with Mr. Krueger's evidence by 4 o'clock, if the Chair would just approve for us just to go just a little bit after 4 o'clock, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Must he be sworn in now?
Yes, may the witness be sworn in?
Administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Jacob Daniel Krueger.
Do you have any objection with making the prescribed affirmation?
No.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you will give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, raise your right hand and say, I truly affirm.
I truly affirm.
Thank you. Yes, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Krueger, can you please turn, if you have not turned over already, to folder CC12 in the file? On page 1, what document is that? On the first page, you'll see the page numbers are written in red on your top right-hand corner.
It's my affidavit.
And will you please turn to page 9 of that document?
Yes.
Is that your signature in the middle of the page?
Yes, that's my signature.
And you deposed to this affidavit on the 12th of August 2019?
Yeah.
Mr. Krueger, you've also stated that you do want to make a correction in your affidavit.
Yeah. On point number 14, there was a mistake slipping in stating that Mr. Matthew is the Chief Financial Officer, but he is in fact was the Acting Chief Executive Officer.
Thank you.
Did you say paragraph 14? Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I can see, yeah. You will arrange for a supplementary affidavit?
Yes, Chair, I've already had a conversation with Mr. Krueger about that.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Other than that, Mr. Krueger, everything is true and correct on the affidavit?
Yeah.
Mr. Krueger, where are you currently employed?
I've retired on the 31st of May from the SABC.
And before being
Is that
employed...
this year?
Say again?
Is that this year?
Yeah, on the
Okay.
31st of May I retired.
Okay.
And Mr. Krueger, before your retirement on the 31st of May, where were you, how long were you employed by the SABC Just to give us just a short background of your career.
I've been employed since 1990 at the SABC, 5 years as a field reporter, 7 years as a senior producer, and then the last 15 years I was the executive producer of the current affairs shows of RSG, the Afrikaans radio station.
And on paragraph 3, Mr. Krueger, you were approached by the investigators of the Commission. Can you just elaborate onto the purpose as to why that the investigators approached you?
I was a part of a group called by the media the SABC 8, after we've been dismissed by the SABC in 2016. And as far as I understand, I was approached to explain the process and what happened at that stage.
And in paragraphs 7, you highlight the start of the editorial interference.
Yes.
From your line managers. Can you talk about, when this editorial interference commenced?
Yes. There was always a sort of editorial interference, but one of the most profound instances was on 5 of February 2014, when the acting head of news at that stage, Sebolelo Diklatanyane, came into my office and informed me that we could not report on any of the activities of the EFF, the Economic Freedom Front Porch at that stage. And when I asked her why, she said it was an order from the 27th floor. And my understanding was that it was coming from the former CEO, Mr. Thari Motswaneng, which was strange because he was not the editor-in-chief and he had nothing to do with news, so I couldn't understand the instruction. And I explained to her that it was not possible to ignore any political party. It was just before an election period, and she said we had no choice because it was a directive from the top. And I told her that we will go on broadcasting news and not ignore the EFF. 10 minutes later, I received a call from the secretary of Mr. Jimmy Matthews, who was the former head of news at that stage. He requested me to come to his office, where in the presence of Ms. Diklatanyane, gave me a speech about not conforming to the rest of the SABC and accused my team of thinking that they were an island on their own. He proceeded to tell me that I have to obey all instructions from Sebolelo or Ms. Diklatanyane, on which I responded that if she gives me instruction, I will listen to it and evaluate it and then act accordingly. It depends on what the instruction is. That was what happened there. What happened also was that on the same year in December, Mr. Motswaneng appointed Mrs. Diklatanyane in a permanent position as head of news.
I'm sorry, Mr. Krueger. Please finish the story about that discussion on the 27th, was it the 27th floor? With
that
Jimmy
comes
Matthews?
later,
Yeah, but I'm
you
thinking
interested?
about whether the program was allowed to be aired, what you wanted to air on TV, and they were saying, no, don't. I want to know whether ultimately what happened to it.
What happened was that there was an outcry in the media after it became known that the SABC didn't want to broadcast any EFF stories. And then the next day or within 2 days, the SABC put out a statement denying that there was any instruction to that effect. So then we carried on with coverage of the EFF.
But on the day that you got instructions, were you not planning to air that on the same day?
We planned to do that, and we did that during our midday program. We had an interview with the EFF, which we broadcast.
Oh, you did go ahead,
Yeah,
despite the instruction?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Mr. Krueger, that directive, that instruction that you had received not to broadcast the EFF, was that in line with the editorial policy at the time?
No, not so ever. It was not in line with any not in line with the Constitution, not in line with the BCCSA's.
It was just completely wrong.
Yeah, it was just completely wrong. There was no way that you can ignore a political party in any country, or any news for that matter that comes to your attention.
Did Mr. Jimmy Matthews, during, you said he gave you a speech or a lecture, did he say why it was that the EFF should not be, events or anything connected with it should not be broadcast?
No, he did not explain that instruction. The only thing that he said that I must listen to my line managers, in that sense the acting head of news, and that I should listen and obey all the instructions. But he did not give me the opportunity to discuss that specific instruction.
So he spoke in general.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the acting head of, did you say it was Miss Ditlanyana? Ditlakanyana.
Ditlakanyana, yeah.
Yes, acting head of radio news. Yeah. Also, this was a radio broadcast, not a TV broadcast that you were planning. So, and when you were speaking with Mr. Matthews, you parted with him on the basis that you would listen to whatever instruction that Ms. Ditlakanyane would be giving you and evaluate it, implying that if you thought that it was a lawful instruction that was in line with the policy of SABC, you would comply. But if you thought it was unlawful or contrary to the SABC's policies, you would not comply. Is that what you were implying?
That's correct. At the SABC, and according to our editorial policy, the decision-making stops at the executive producer, and that was my position. It is only when you are uncertain of certain decisions that you must make, or when there's a lot of money involved to do a trip or whatever, that you would do the upwards referral route. Then you'll go to your superior or your next line manager and discuss it with her. If you're uncertain of the content of certain issues, then you'll do that. But usually the buck stops at the executive producer, and anything from outside we would deem as interference into your programs.
So on that day, you went ahead and broadcast whatever you wanted to broadcast in regard to the EFF, contrary to Mr. Ditlakanyane's instruction. Were there any consequences to you as a result of you not complying with that instruction, or not really?
No consequences. As I said, shortly after that, the SABC put out a statement which, of course,
denying.
Protected me and my point of view. They said, there's no such an instruction, although it happened.
It had happened. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Krueger, let's jump on to paragraph 12 of your statement, where you highlight a second incident of an editorial interference with the SABC announcing that they were not going to cover any protest action.
I may have interrupted your planning. I think he was starting on 10 about Mr. Mtsoneng appointing Ms. Ditlakanyane in the permanent position when I interrupted him. I don't know if he had finished that part.
I was just referring to the fact that later that year, Mr. Mtsoneng appointed Mrs. Ditlakanyane in the permanent position of head of radio news. Mr. Matthews was appointed as the GE of News and Current Affairs, while another employee, Ms. Nontando Maseko, became the head of television news. That was the announcement was made on the same day, and and later in 2019, when Mr. Joe Slaughter's report was released, all three of them were fingered as part of people that was part of giving instructions to the newsroom. I think it was just worth making that point.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, a witness that we have allocated for Friday would be able to talk to this report in detail. Going back to paragraph 12, Mr. Krueger, you highlighted a media statement issued by the SABC saying they were not going to cover any protest action.
Yeah.
Can you talk to this? Can you give us the foundational phase as to, why this began and, how the editorial interference, how was it implemented then?
The SABC released a sent out a press release on the 26th of May 2016, where they banned all coverage of violent protest action. Now, it was very strange to us and also to the media outside, because that's clearly a form of censorship. So on the 30th of May, we invited 3 guests to our show in the morning to discuss this development. It was Tim du Plessis, who was from Media 24, Professor Franz Krueger, who was from Wits University, and Mr. Thari Motsoeneng, who at first he declined. He did not arrive at the studio. So we had a discussion on this policy, which was clearly not editorially sound. It was not constitutionally sound. You cannot withhold information from the people. If you look at the BCSA, if you look at ICASA's regulations, and also at our own editorial policy, it is totally out of line. So we had a discussion, and the next morning, the 31st of May, we conducted a studio interview with Mr. Motsoeneng, who was accompanied by Mr. Anton Younes, who was his I don't know what he was. He was never introduced, but he sat into the studio, maybe because he could understand Afrikaans. Afterwards, there was a debate between me and Mr. Motsoeneng and Mr. Younes regarding the content of the previous day's interview. And I told them we had a problem as journalists to read about certain policy or issues in the media, and no one within the SABC ever communicated the directive directly to us. And then I was issued up to the 27th floor, where I was joined by Mr. Younes, who's the acting head of news, Mr. Simon Tebele, Mr. Matthews, Jimmy Matthews, who was the acting chief executive officer at that stage, Mrs. Dikla Kanyane, and a colleague, Mrs. Krivani Pillay, who was the executive producer of SAFM at that stage. What happened there was that each one of the people made turns to explain certain things. I took notes of it, which I typed afterwards. If the chair wants, I can just go through what happened there at that meeting.
Yes, okay.
Mr. Motsoeneng started in saying, we are cleaning up the organization. People are doing their own stuff. There are many journalists outside that want to work for the SABC. The environment outside is bad. And he continues saying, no person is independent. The SABC is independent. This is a new SABC. You must adapt or find a job somewhere else. Then he said that Tim du Plessis was from a rival organization. We cannot allow people from outside to say anything negative about the SABC. And he also accused us that we asked Franz Krueger leading questions during the interview. And then he switched over to something that my colleague Krivani Pillay will later explain when she testified about Editors Forum, which was one of the programs that must go. Then Anton Heunis was an advisor, sort of advisor for Mr. Motsoeneng, said, I'm RSG listener. I know I'm not a journalist, but you misunderstand editorial freedom and that we are asking leading questions. And then he asked me, why
I'm sorry. What's RSG listener?
RSG is the Afrikaans public broadcasting station on the SABC bouquet. We've got a radio station for each and every language.
Oh.
So RSG
is a radio station.
Yeah, it's a radio
Afrikaans
station, like SAFM is for the
Oh,
English-speaking
okay,
people,
yes.
RSG, or Ikukwezi, or
Yes, Ukhozi FM
for
and
the
so
different radio stations.
Oh.
So RSG is the Afrikaans
What's the
radio
full
station.
name?
Radio Sonder Grense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So then Anton Heunis asked me, why didn't we do an insert about that shows that the presence of cameras on unrest scenes leads to violence. And
Sorry, Mr. Krueger, can you just identify who Futa is? Because there
Futa,
are
okay, Futa is my nickname. That is not my real birth name.
Okay.
It comes from Mafuta when I was a small boy, so.
Oh, is it like Mafuta in isiZulu?
Yeah, that's good.
Well, I can understand what it means.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people do understand. Yes, thank you.
And then he asked us, why didn't we use research to show that the presence of cameras do lead to violence? And then I asked him, I said to him, but if you liaise with your editors beforehand, and if you told us that you were going to give this instruction, then we could have used the research that you based your instruction on. And then Mr. Motsoeneng said, but I don't believe in research. He said, you must defend the organization. No journalist is independent. The CEO has a final responsibility for news, which was also strange to me because the CEO has got nothing to do with news. The COO is the Chief Operating Officer, which deals with operations, and the CEO is the editor-in-chief. It was only shortly after that we realized that Mr. Motsoeneng changed the editorial policy, and it was signed off in February, 3 months earlier, which made him the de facto head of news.
Oh.
But we didn't know that. It was never communicated. It only came later.
Do you recall? Do you recall who would have signed that? Would it have been himself, making himself head of, or the person with final say on news, or was it somebody else?
What happened? There's a process that we started in the end of 2014. At that stage, the editorial policy in place was from 2004, and we had to renew it. So we started with a process at the SABC to discuss the policy. I was part of 3 of those discussions, and then the head of that group, the policy-making group, said they are going to taking the policy to the public, and afterwards they will come back to us and give feedback regarding the changes that would be accepted. It never happened. It never happened, and we only realized later that it was pushed through with no consultation, no feedback to the people of the SABC. And between the lines, it was a small paragraph, you could see that the COO was now in charge of news, who was Mr. Motsoeneng.
Okay.
At that stage, Slowly turned to the acting head of news, who was Mr. Simon Tebele, and he said, Simon, if people do not adhere, get rid of them. We cannot have people to question management. This is the last time we have a meeting of this kind. From now on, you handle things on your level. And then Mr. Matthews, the only thing he said was, it is cold outside. If you don't like it, you can go. You have two choices, the door or the window. And that was about it in that meeting.
Mr. Krueger, can we jump onto paragraph 15, where you highlight a pre-election workshop? Can you just shortly just explain what is the purpose of a pre-election workshop, who attends a pre-election workshop and so forth?
The pre-election workshop, usually it's attended by all the regional editors and the news editors from all the provinces. It is, usually we had a workshop like that every year to bring all the editors together at one place. But at that stage, I don't think we had one in a while. But before that specific election in 2016, everyone was flown in from all the provinces, and we had an election workshop where we discussed the strategy and the planning. It was a sort of a planning meeting for the coverage of the coming election.
Okay, and in this election, you highlight that Mr. Motsoeneng had made certain statements which you had recorded in notes, in handwriting notes, in handwritten notes. And those notes you've attached them as annexures on 03 and 04. Chair, that would be on pages 78. He has also highlighted them in the statement because it is difficult for one to read the handwritten notes.
Yeah, it's quite difficult.
And the second set would be on page 79. Mr. Krueger,
Could you move away from 78, or you're still at 78?
no, Chair, I didn't. These were just to indicate that these were actually the handwritten notes from that meeting.
Oh, okay.
I'm just going to head back into the paragraph because it'll be quite difficult to look at those handwritten notes, but he has captured them in his main statement, his main affidavit.
Okay, okay. So we go back to his statement.
His statement, and that would be paragraph 16 on page 6.
Okay. Was his statement at the beginning? No, it's not at the beginning.
It's not the beginning, it's
What
under
page?
folder 12. Page
Folder
6?
12. Okay. And what paragraph?
Paragraph 16.
Okay.
Mr. Krueger, am I correct in saying this is an extraction from what Mr. Motsoeneng was saying?
Yeah.
And I've noted that you have put this complete paragraphs in quotes. Is this word for word as to what Mr. Motsoeneng was saying? Or was it just, were you paraphrasing? Can you just explain?
It was a bit of both. What I did, I dotted down certain words that he was saying, and then directly after that, I typed it out as stated here in this affidavit.
Okay. Can you just read out 16.1? What was stated by Mr. Motsoeneng?
Mr. Motsoeneng spoke to us at two different occasions. The gist of it was that the SABC is independent, no individual is independent. He said there's an agenda for the corporation driven by 3 directors, the CEO, the COO, and the CFO. He said, do not focus on negative stories. It's important that you balance stories. Tell human stories. Is politicians not human beings? Reporters at the SABC do not know the world. When they report, they mislead listeners. He said, go to America, there's poverty. They do not show it. They do not show when their soldiers die. I'll take you to the Brics countries, and you can just go to a hotel. You will see that South Africa is better. Then he referred to the editorial policy. He said, look at the editorial policy. We have removed news and replaced it with content. If you, as SABC, mess up the organization, you mess up your life. I'm in charge. News is now part of operations. We change the world. We must have news with content. I'm in charge. You must adhere to any instruction. President Zuma is the president of the country. I don't regard him as ANC. You cannot treat him the same. We will give him more time. And you can question everyone, and he mentioned Gwede Mantashe and other names, except your president. We need to respect him, especially you, SABC. I expect you to align you with my instruction.
Mr. Krueger, and what was the response to these statements that Mr. Motsoeneng was saying? I mean, you have a room full of editors and people in the profession who are very knowledgeable about editorial policies and how broadcasting should work. What was the response to his statements, Mr. Motsoeneng's statements?
I'm not sure what the other people's reaction was. We were so used to what we call Flowry speak at that stage that he was just, we thought he was just babbling on. At that stage, what I did, I messaged a colleague of mine back at Auckland Park asking to go through our intranet, which, where the editorial policy is displayed, and to see which policy the SABC is using, and there was no sign of the 2016 or the new editorial policy. It was still the old 2004 policy. So I was puzzled. The people did not show a lot of reaction. There was no one questioning the fact that he said that, but he also left directly after that. Mr. Motsoeneng left, and there was no time to discuss this instructions.
So there was no pursuing what he had said at the time, just everybody just left it in the air?
You know how workshops work. You sit there and you listen and you make notes, and afterwards everyone is doing anyway their own things. You know? And as I said, at that stage, it was very confusing within the newsroom, especially after the 26th of May statement. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to react, because if you cannot cover protests or broadcast protests, are you still covering it but you don't broadcast it? Do you send out a team of reporters to a scene, but if there's violence, then you take them back to the office? So everything was very confusing at that stage, and there was not a lot of guidance from someone like Mr. Jimmy Matthews, who was at that stage well, according to us, the editor-in-chief. He just said he derives his oxygen from the newsroom, and there's not a lot of oxygen at the 28th floor where his offices was. And he said he was not going to give any editorial guidance. So he left it to Mr. Motsoeneng to give us editorial guidance.
I see that you put what Mr. Motsoeneng said in quotation marks. Did you mechanically record what you were saying? In paragraph 16.1, You just read that whole paragraph, which is in quotation marks. Did you mechanically record what he was saying?
There was a recording made by people who were there, but this comes from my notes. And it also formed part of an affidavit that we sent into the Constitutional Court
Yes.
in 2016.
So you accurately just wrote down what he was saying?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Krueger, there's been evidence of potential purging that had happened at the SABC. And you highlight in paragraph 17 that you yourself became a victim of this purging at the SABC. Can you just elaborate on how that came to be about, how that came along?
Yeah. What happened after the statement to ban violent protest on the 26th of May, there was an outcry from all over the country, from the media and especially the NGOs, and there was a protest march planned to 3 of the SABC's offices, and on the morning of the 20th of June, I participated in a line talk, a daily line talk, where the acting head of news, Mr. Simon Tebele, gave instructions to remove 3 of the stories from our top story list. To explain, we have a diary every day, and there's a list of top stories, and then there's a diary of each and every region. So as an editor seated in Johannesburg, I can have a look at the top stories, and then look at all the regions and see all the promised stories that should arrive before the end of the day or for the next morning's show. So it gives you an indication of what to expect. And the top stories are the most important stories, and we try, every program and news bulletin tries to focus on those stories. So that morning, Mr. Simon Tebele removed 3 of the stories. It was a Y2K, the Right to Know campaign, that organized marches to the SABC to complain against the policy of not showing violent protest. Yeah. And at that stage, the economics editor, Ms. Thandeka Kubule, questioned Mr. Tebele's decision, and then he explained to her that it must be removed because it's about us, the SABC. And I understand it that meeting on the 27th floor where they said we cannot criticize the SABC, we cannot allow people to criticize the SABC. And I made that connection at that stage. So they removed those stories because it was negative, or it was about the SABC. And that whole meeting was recorded by my colleague Suna Fenter, which we later transcribed, and it's all what you see here is part of that transcription. Where Mr. Tebele said those stories are out, as discussed earlier. Then Thandeka explained that she doesn't want to be part of a decision like that. And she said, and if this whole issue ends up in court, and I quote there, and when we fall foul of the law, God forbid, we better just have recorded even the dissenting voices. Please record my voice as dissenting. Then I said, I totally agree with you. The initial decision, or initially they said, we cannot give other newspapers a platform to criticize the SABC. That I totally understand. They're in the media, but this is not a media issue. It's not other newspapers or opposition or whatever. This is the NGO. It is out there, and if we ignore them, we are busy censoring our own news, and that is totally unacceptable. At that stage, Suna Fente, who was my colleague at RSG, said, and as junior as I am, please record my voice as dissenting against this. And on which I replied, we cannot allow people, individuals in this company, making decisions on behalf of journalists. If we are going to carry on with that, we are going to lose all integrity, the little integrity that we have at the moment. And then it carried on. Mr. Tebele acknowledged the fact that we opposed the decision to remove the stories from the diary. And then 3 days later, on the 23rd of June, Mr. Kubule and Mrs. Fenter and myself were called in separately and notified of our suspension.
Mr. Krueger, let's just go back. The removal of these 3 stories were against the editorial policy. Is that correct?
Yeah. At the SABC, we always have the problem as part of one of the SOEs, and also as part of the media. It was always difficult to report on yourself or what happened in your own company. So I can understand from certain people's point of view that you do not, there's a lot of companies that forbid people to talk about their own company, but in our situation, we were also part of the media, and according to me, we had, if there's anything negative about the SABC, we have to put it on up there, get people to react, give the SABC the right to respond, and report it as our editorial policy expects from us. We cannot, we're not in a position. The thing is, there's 22 million people in the country that their only source of news is the SABC. They cannot afford newspapers, they cannot afford DSTV. So it's very important for the SABC to fulfill that role of giving news to each and every one in this country. And we cannot ignore something like that.
And did Mr. Tabele give any justifiable reasons that are in line with the editorial policy as to why these 3 stories should not be aired?
No, the only reason was it is about us. That was his only reason, and then we continued with the line talk. There was no further discussion allowed.
And subsequent to that encounter about the removal of these 3 stories, was that when you were dismissed?
Yeah, what happened then, we went to the Labour Court on the 18th of July. There was a disciplinary hearing. I think Ms. Kruvani Pillay will explain that, what happened there. There was they tried to conduct a disciplinary hearing, but it was never concluded, and then we were waiting for a next date to appear, and before we appeared, we were all dismissed. I was dismissed along with 7 other colleagues.
So from the time from the disciplinary hearing to your dismissal, if I'm correct, that's less than 24 hours?
What happened was, the initial disciplinary hearing, there was a planned meeting to go to the Constitutional Court on the Friday. We called it Black Friday. And we were supposed, me, Tandeka, and Suna, were supposed to lead the march to the Constitutional Court. And 23 hours earlier, before that, I received a phone call from the disciplinary committee and telling me that I must be at the disciplinary hearing the same morning as the march to the Constitutional Court, which was a breach of their own disciplinary code, because you need to give someone at least 24 hours notice. You must remember at that stage we were locked out of the SABC, and we had not access to our computers, to any files, to anything that you could use in a during a disciplinary hearing to defend yourself.
And the Labour Court found your dismissals were not
Invalid.
lawful, invalid, and you were reinstated thereafter?
Yeah, as if we were never dismissed, yeah.
Chair, Mr. Matthews has responded to the 3-3 notice that was issued on behalf of Mr. Krueger. That would be CC25, the small presentation file. Mr. Krueger, there's a small presentation file just next to you on top, CC25. I'm just going to highlight the relevant paragraphs. His response is from page 18.
That is his response to Mr. Krueger's statement.
Indeed so, Chair.
Yes, okay. And you will put his response to Mr. Krueger, from Mr. Krueger to comment on what Mr. Matthews has to say.
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Krueger, are you there on page 18?
I'm on page 18, yes.
Paragraph 13, he states that in the Rule 3.3 notice dated the 13th of August 2019, it is suggested that I have been implicated in paragraphs 9, 10, 11, 14, and 14.6 of Mr. Krueger's affidavit. I accordingly respond thereto as follows. Paragraph 9 of the affidavit. As I've indicated earlier in this affidavit, the editor-in-chief at the SABC was CEO Muto. He made all decisions in relation to editorial and newsworthy matters, and in that vein, he made decisions about what could or could not be reported. It is in that context that I have repeatedly indicated that environment at the SABC at the time was toxic or corrosive, and that everybody was expected to conform to his instructions, failing which the prospect of termination loomed large. Next paragraph. On that day, Dietrich informed Krueger.
Maybe, do you want to let him comment if he has any comment on paragraph 30.1?
Indeed so, Chair.
Is there anything you want to say about what Mr. Matthews says in paragraph 30.1 that has been read to you?
He's only half right. My paragraph 9 refers to something that happened in 2014,
Yes.
when
He was no longer there.
when Mr. Motsoeneng was not, he was COO, but according to the editorial policy at that stage, the editor-in-chief was the CEO, and I think it was Ms. Lulama Okobo who
Yes.
testified earlier at that stage.
Yes.
So it's wrong of him to say that Mr. Motsoeneng was in fact the de facto news boss in 2014.
Yes.
Maybe he knew something that I didn't know at that stage, but according to our editorial policy, it was still the CEO.
Yes, okay.
However, the latter part of that is correct, that in 2016, at that stage, Mr. Motsoeneng was already the editor-in-chief.
The next paragraph. On that day, Dietrich informed Krueger, who was her direct report about Motsoeneng's instructions regarding the EFF. In light of Mr. Krueger's response to her, she approached me for advice about him, not only in relation to this incident, but in relation to his generally confrontational approach towards her in the past. It was in that general context of his historical conduct towards her, which in my view often bordered on racist and sexist conduct, that I thought it would be appropriate to intervene and inform him that his attitude towards Ditlakanyane was not appropriate nor acceptable.
That's the easy way out. It's one of the most common excuses. If a man differs with a woman, it's either sexist, and if she's black, then it's racist. He's playing the man and not the ball. The issue here was an instruction from my superior, my line manager, that we cannot report on any EFF activities. That's the issue. Not the fact that I'm sometimes confrontational. Of course, in a newsroom, it's a robust environment, and sometimes we are confrontational, and it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman or black or colored. It's not the issue. That's not the issue. The issue was the instruction that Sebolelo gave me lawful or not? But he tries to avoid it by using a sexist or a racist implication.
Responding to your paragraphs 10 and 11 of the affidavit, it reads, in paragraph 10, Mr. Krueger avers that on the 1st of December 2014, I was appointed in the position of Group Executive News. In paragraph 11, Mr. Krueger makes a broad assertion that I've been fingered, in other words, implicated in the report. His assertion is general and non-specific, and I have in any event dealt with the relevant portions of the report above.
I read Mr. Joe Tlolo's report, and it was definite that Sebolelo and Simon Tebele was giving instructions via certain people to the newsroom. So if that's not fingered, I'm not sure what he means. Maybe I made the wrong deduction. We can look at it when we discuss the Joe Tlolo report and the implications of that.
In response to paragraphs 14 and 14.6 of Mr. Krueger's affidavit, Mr. Matthew replies, in these paragraphs, Mr. Krueger suggests that I was either involved in or sought enforcement of Mr. Mtsoneng's decisions to ban any coverage of violent protests. I have indicated earlier in this affidavit, Mtsoneng made all critical decisions as they relate to SABC and politics. It was him that I reported, and it was his instructions that I ultimately carried out. And the report confirms Mtsoneng firmly established that he, as a COO, has the final responsibility for news. I accordingly repeat the contents of paragraphs 15 and 16 above for Mr. Krueger's contents. I also confirm that I tendered my resignation before the decision to dismiss the SABC 8 was taken or implemented.
Yeah, this is very sad that the newsroom was not protected at that stage. If Mr. Jimmy Matthews said that Mr. Slari Mtsoneng had the final say about news, and it's maybe just an indication of what was going on in the newsroom. You must remember at that stage, we were not informed that the CEO is now the de facto head of news, or the editor-in-chief. At that stage, the SABC had not told anyone, as far as I know, that there was a change in the editorial policy. But he resigned, that I agree with, before the decision to dismiss, but there was no one, not one line manager, not one person in the SABC that stood up and defend any of the dismissals or any of the suspensions, not one. And he was part of that.
Thank you, Mr. Krueger. Chair, just to go to the information about the transcripts, we do have a recording of the meeting that Mr. Krueger did highlight. But however, that recording, from what I've been informed, is not clear enough. However, if the chair wants to have a listen to it, we can provide the chair with that recording. However, I've been told by the
Is it anything for which there is a transcript already here?
No, there hasn't. It's for what is said in Mr. Krueger's statement. There hasn't been any dispute of the authenticity or.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the recording that you're talking about.
Yes, Chair.
Is it a recording in respect of which we already have a transcript here?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, if there is a transcript, it's okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
And paragraphs 24 to 25 speaks about the transcriber, how these were transcribed in your affidavit and so forth. And you did hand in a recording to the investigators. However, as we relayed, it was not clear enough for us to play, but it is a true reflection of what is stated in your affidavit.
It is true. Yeah.
And that would conclude the end of Mr. Krueger's affidavit as well. Mr. Krueger, is there anything that you would like to add on top of, if there's anything that you feel that we have not relayed, but we have to come to the end of your affidavit?
Maybe just one thing, and referring back to Mr. Matthews' argument or affidavit, is that the people must understand that the newsroom at that stage, there was a toxic fear, there was uncertainty. There was no protection from anyone, not Mr. Matthews, not Mr. Tebele, not Mr. Motsoneng, and it was a very, very difficult situation to work in. And I think if I can just mention what happened yesterday with Ms. Patiswa Mahopeni, the new head of news, that's the sort of leadership that we need in a newsroom. You need a newsroom that's bulletproof, that's free from interference, where you can do your job as any other journalist should do. And that did not happen during 2016. That's all I want to say.
Chair, just to bring the chair's attention to, we do have a transcription of that recording. It's on page 121 of CC12.
Okay, that's fine, that's fine.
And that would conclude the evidence of Mr. Krueger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krueger, for coming and for sharing with the Commission your experiences. Thank you very much. You are excused.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tomorrow, how many witnesses have we got?
We've got, as far as I know, we have 2 witnesses.
So we could start at 10?
Yes, Chair, 10 o'clock.
Okay. We'll adjourn the proceedings for the day and we'll start at 10 o'clock tomorrow. We adjourn.
All rise.